Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea is celebrating the Lunar New Year holiday, Seollal, this weekend. We go live to Seoul Station this evening, where one of the largest exoduses from the capital is underway. Starting January 30th, people in South Korea are no longer required to wear masks in most indoor spaces. The lifting of one of the last major COVID-19 restrictions comes as the country marks 3 years in the pandemic. President Yoon rounds off his 8-day two-nation tour to the UAE and Switzerland. From sales diplomacy to a special address at the Davos Forum, we highlight the achievements made during the trip. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in South Korea, and thank you for joining us on Arirang News. We begin with a mass travel ahead of the Lunar New Year holiday, Seollal, here in South Korea. No doubt it's one of the biggest holidays for Koreans. Nearly half of the nation's population are expected to travel, as it's the first Seollal since the end of social distancing rules. Let's go straight to our Choi Min-jung, who's out at Seoul Station. Min-jung, how is it looking over there?
Well, it's a day before the actual 4-day holiday begins, but Seoul Station has been packed with people since the morning. It's the first holiday free of social distancing rules ever since the pandemic began, so there are definitely more people out here than last year. Here we can see people with both hands full of presents for their relatives, people buying snacks for the trip, and many waiting to get on the train. I talked to a few happy passengers before, looking excited to head home, so let's take a listen.
It's been a while since I went to my hometown to celebrate the holidays, so I'm excited and happy.
Even when our family did get together, we weren't able to see everyone all at once. We always gathered in smaller groups. I don't think our family has ever planned to get together this big.
Tickets to key destinations like Busan, Daegu, and Pohang are already sold out, so it may be too late to get tickets now. But for those still wanting to try, I recommend frequently checking for canceled tickets on the smartphone app of the Korea Railroad Corporation.
Now, Min-jung, this holiday, millions are expected to travel around the nation to spend time with their families and loved ones. What can you tell us more?
The Korea Transport Institute forecasts that more than 26 million people will be heading home, with 5 million each day. That's more than 20% compared to last year. Now, most people usually go by car, so if you're driving, note that expressways will be toll-free from Saturday to Tuesday. And the government has also increased public transport capacity by running extra buses, trains, and flights. In Seoul, subways and buses will operate until 2 a.m. on Sunday and Monday. Although the social distancing rules are gone, the authorities say people should still wear masks and avoid eating while on trains, planes, and buses. To help prevent the spread of COVID-19, there will be PCR testing centers set up at 6 highway rest areas around the country. That's all from me. I hope everyone enjoys a safe and happy holiday. Back to you, Jiang.
Thank you, Min-jung, for being out there for us. That was our Choi Min-jung live at the nation's one of the busiest transportation hubs. Starting January 30th, indoor mask requirements here in South Korea will be scrapped in most places except for hospitals and on public transportation. It's one of the country's last major COVID-19 restrictions. Lee Dae-yeon tells us more.
South Korea's indoor mask mandate will be lifted from January 30th. The decision was made during a Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters meeting on Friday. And from that day, mask wearing inside will be recommended rather than a requirement. It will take effect following this weekend's Lunar New Year holiday, with travel and family gatherings increasing during that period. And while mask wearing will no longer be mandated at most places, including schools, movie theaters, and restaurants, they will still need to be worn at facilities like hospitals, care homes, and on public transportation. During the meeting, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo said the decision came after a number of COVID-19 requirements, including a downward trend in figures for the deaths and the critically ill, were met. He added that there's a high possibility of a temporary increase in newly confirmed cases after the holiday, as cases rose at the same point last year. The Prime Minister said vaccination is vital to protect against any such increase.
With the lifting of the indoor mask mandate, vaccination has become more important. We advise unvaccinated people above 60 and elderly people living in vulnerable areas to get inoculated as soon as possible.
The decision means South Korea will no longer be the only country out of 38 OECD nations to fully require mask wearing indoors. 16 countries, including the US, Japan, and Canada, are free from wearing masks indoors. While in other countries, mask mandates are still in place at some facilities like medical centers and on public transportation. With the introduction of the new rules, South Korea will be left with just 2 COVID-19 restrictions still being enforced. 7 days isolation for confirmed cases, as well masking up while at certain public facilities. Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says they are set to discuss reducing the number of days in isolation for those who test positive.
There have been related discussions here, and countries like Hong Kong and Japan are already having talks. Officials feel it's now time to start discussing shortening the isolation period as indoor mask mandates are lifted.
The official added they would gradually consider lifting isolation measures altogether, depending on whether the WHO decides to downgrade COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern, as well as changes to South Korea's own COVID alert level. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
The announcement to lift South Korea's indoor mask mandate comes as the country marks 3 years since recording its first COVID-19 case. And while we're not completely out of the woods yet, the decision means almost a complete return to normalcy. Our Shin Se-byuk looks back the past 3 years in the pandemic.
January 20th, 2020. Exactly 3 years ago today, the very first COVID-19 case was confirmed in South Korea. Since then, the virus has infected nearly 30 million people, killing 33,000. During that time, South Korea faced a series of infection waves and changes in policies. The year 2020 was when the so-called new normal began with a series of social distancing measures announced in April. Schools closed, businesses were forced to shut down, and large group gatherings were prohibited. And in October, it became mandatory to wear a mask. In 2021, with the hope of getting back to normal, the first vaccine inoculations began in February. But the Delta variant emerged in the summer, causing infections to spike and hospitals to suffer bed shortages. In November, with high vaccination rates, the country took its first steps towards a gradual return to normal life. But it abruptly came to a halt the following month due to the Omicron variant. Game-changing oral treatments, namely Pfizer's Paxlovid pill, were rolled out at the start of 2022, but Omicron infections kept rising. Record after record, 6-digit cases every day. And in mid-March, it peaked with over 600,000 infections reported in a single day. After the peak in March, health authorities announced the lifting of social distancing measures, ending the cap on social gatherings and limits to business hours. In May, people were no longer required to wear masks outdoors unless they were in large gatherings. 4 months later, the government decided to completely lift the outdoor mask mandate. And starting in October, those entering the country from overseas were no longer required to submit negative COVID results. And now, in 2023, the country is looking to scrap its very last antivirus measure, the indoor mask mandate. While there's no doubt that the country is on track to back to pre-pandemic life, an infectious diseases expert warns that people should stay vigilant.
There are other kinds of coronaviruses that cause light cold symptoms, but some kinds cause severe pneumonia, as we've seen in the past, like MERS, SARS, and of course COVID-19. The virus is likely to continue taking a death toll of around 10,000 every year.
As for the possibility of a new variant emerging, the expert says,
we should remember that new variants can always emerge and cause a dramatic spike in cases globally. Keeping that in mind, what matters now is that we come up with a systematic and better response system for future health crises.
3 years of COVID-19, we are only inches away from finally returning to pre-pandemic normalcy. But what has changed now and then is the need for people's continuous vigilance against the virus and a proper medical response system for future pandemics. 신세벽, Arirang News.
It was not yet clear that COVID-19 was going to evolve into a pandemic when South Korea saw its first confirmed case in the beginning of 2020. Public perceptions of the virus seems to have changed quite a lot over the past 3 years. Our Kim Hyun-sung tells us more about that change.
It's been 3 years since South Korea's first case of COVID-19. Worries over a new infectious disease scared people off the streets and even emptied out this bustling neighborhood of Sinchon. But now the streets are bustling with people again who have become used to living side by side with the virus.
I think COVID-19 has become a lot like the common cold.
We have 10 people in our family, but everyone has had COVID except for one person. It's become really common.
At first, people were more scared of it, but now it's way more normal.
Throughout the pandemic, South Korea went through a pack of different prevention policies, from detailed contact tracing to the social gathering limits that only allowed 2 people at one sitting after 6 p.m. Usually this street is packed with customers, with tables filling up this entire space here. But on the day that the level 4 measures are starting, the area has gone mostly empty. All these changes had deep-reaching effects on people's lives.
It was tough because we're students and all our classes went online after COVID.
A lot of the local businesses closed down due to COVID. Even now, there are a lot of stores that are empty.
In that time, public perception of COVID has changed quite a lot as well. Even while COVID numbers climbed to the hundreds of thousands, people started to perceive COVID as less and less risky. This change in view has led to new perspectives on the old health measures.
At the time, I was very conservative about COVID-19, so I thought all these measures were very necessary. But in hindsight, they seem a bit extreme and may have restricted a lot of people's freedom.
Back in 2019, nobody had even heard of the coronavirus. As we gain more knowledge, it's healthy to reevaluate our viewpoints so that we are better prepared for future crises. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Having highlighted international solidarity and unity at this year's Davos Forum and meeting with quantum physicists at ETH Zurich, President Yoon Suk-yeol is on his way back home after an 8-day two-nation tour, which also took him to the UAE. Our top office bureau chief, Moon Gun-young, has a wrap-up of South Korea's week of global sales.
Our first, second, and third priorities on this foreign tour were focused on the economy, and the economy alone.
As recapped by senior aide, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol concludes his whirlwind week of sales diplomacy on this Friday, having secured tens of billions of dollars in investment from the Emirates and pledging to have his country play a vital role in restoring global supply chains.
특히 모하메드 대통령께서 한국에 300억 불 투자를 결정하면서
A staggering $30 billion investment decision came after Presidents Yoon Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan held a bilateral in Abu Dhabi Sunday in the first ever state visit to the UAE by a South Korean president. The investment, as officials said, is aimed at boosting bilateral cooperation in the fields of nuclear energy, hydrogen, and other renewable energy sources, and defense. Accompanied by a delegation of some 100 South Korean business leaders, including heads of Samsung, Hyundai Motors, and SK Groups, Mr. Yoon continued his salesman pitch in the Swiss alpine town of Davos, promoting his country as an attractive investment destination.
앞으로 여기 한국 시장도 열려 있고 제 사무실도 열려 있으니 언제든지 찾아주시기를 부탁드리겠습니다.
And it was his pledge to become a key partner in the global supply chain that he stressed as he became the first South Korean president in 9 years to address the World Economic Forum in Davos.
지금 가장 시급한 것은 호혜적 연대를 바탕으로 한 공급망의 복원력 강화입니다.
Noting recent supply disruptions in food, energy, chips, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals across the globe, Yoon called for international solidarity and unity that translates to action. Yoon's office wrapped up the South Korean leader's 8-day two-nation tour as
we were able to secure $30 billion worth of investment pledges and ink 48 MOUs in the UAE and discuss $800 million worth of investment with foreign companies like Vestas, Merck Life Sciences, and Novartis.
Nonetheless, the South Korean president returns home to a pile of issues to settle, including the recent emergence of diplomatic tensions, as well as the task of revitalizing the domestic economy as Koreans head into Seollal, the Korean New Year holiday. 문건영, Arirang News.
South Korea's foreign ministry today called in a senior official from the Japanese embassy to lodge a formal protest against Tokyo's recent efforts to have a historic gold mine where it used forced labor listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Baeunji reports.
The Sado Mine was a place where at least 1,000 Koreans were subjected to forced labor under harsh conditions during World War II. Located in Niigata Prefecture in Japan, it was known as one of the largest producers of gold in the world in the 17th century. And after the Pacific War broke out, it was used to obtain copper, iron, and other materials needed for war. Japan has been pushing to have this place designated as a World Heritage Site, despite strong objections from South Korea. The Japanese news outlet NHK reported Friday that in its latest effort, Tokyo has resubmitted a letter of recommendation to UNESCO. This is to supplement an initial version submitted last February that UNESCO said was incomplete and declined to review. In protest, South Korea's foreign ministry on Friday summoned the Minister of Economic Affairs at the Japanese embassy in Seoul, Daisuke Namioka. The spokesperson for Seoul's foreign ministry also issued a statement expressing deep regret over what it said was an attempt by Japan to list another place linked to forced labor as a World Heritage Site. Despite having not yet fulfilled its previous pledge in 2015 to acknowledge the subjection of Koreans to forced labor on Hashima Island, for which Japan managed to secure the UNESCO designation. The ministry added that it'll continue to work with the international community and UNESCO to make sure such designations reflect the site's full history, including the painful past of Japan's wartime forced labor. Baeunji, Arirang News.
The Biden administration has announced a new security aid package for Ukraine. However, it did not include the heavy tanks that Ukraine has asked for. Ahead of the announcement, a number of European countries also pledged further military support for Ukraine. Shin-Ayong has the details.
The Pentagon on Thursday announced a new Ukraine security package worth $2.5 billion. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, the aid includes 90 Stryker armored personnel carriers, 59 Bradley fighting vehicles, and 53 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, or MRAPs. It also includes ammunition for the HIMARS rocket system. It's the second largest military support package from the Biden administration and follows a package earlier this month worth $3.8 billion. However, the U.S. did not provide the M1 Abrams tanks that Ukraine has repeatedly asked for. In a briefing on Thursday, the Pentagon's Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh said it does not make sense to provide Abrams tanks to Ukraine at this moment. Her remarks came after German officials said they will not provide tanks to Ukraine until Washington decides to do so. Singh, however, said the kinds of security assistance that Germany provides is a sovereign decision for Germany. Meanwhile, several other European countries pledged further military aid to Ukraine. The UK promised to send 600 Brimstone missiles, while Denmark said it would give 19 French-made Caesar howitzers. On Friday, Finland promised more than 400 million euros worth of defense equipment. Further details are expected after the Western Allies defense ministers meet on Friday at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Meanwhile, the Washington Post, citing unnamed U.S. and Ukrainian sources, reports that U.S. Central Intelligence Agency Director William Burns met with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Kyiv last week and briefed Zelensky on what the CIA sees Russia planning for the battlefield this spring. The American official did not disclose the details of the meeting to the Post, but said the U.S. side reinforced its continued support for Ukraine. Shin-Ayong, Arirang News.
Last week, our reporter Song Yujin guided us through the history of Korean emigration in the first part of her 120 Years of Emigration series. This week, she's back with part 2, focusing on specific individuals who made meaningful changes for their home country, even though they were living abroad.
After the first group of Koreans emigrated to Hawaii in 1903, thousands followed. Hawaii was more than a land of new beginnings. It's also where the overseas independence movement of Koreans against Japan started.
Korean immigrants made their living by working on sugar plantations and coffee farms. They donated what they earned to independence activists and worked to raise awareness of Korea's independence movement abroad. Activist Kim Gu wrote in his autobiography that the funds raised by Korean Americans were the backbone of the movement.
The Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs this January is putting the spotlight on independence activists An Hyun-kyung and Lee Won-sun. Their contributions can be seen at the Independence Hall of Korea. An was born in Seoul in 1881 and moved to Hawaii in 1905. As part of the Korean National Association in Honolulu, he sent a protest letter to the Japanese emperor regarding Japan's illegal occupation of Korea's territory. He was one of the founding members of Dongjihoe alongside Lee Seung-man, who later became South Korea's first president. This group supported the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai, China, and worked to bring overseas Koreans together. Lee Won-sun was also born in Seoul in 1893 and moved to Hawaii from Shanghai in 1914. Lee played a big role in raising funds for independence activists as a member of the Korean Commission to America. The two joined forces and created the United Korean Committee in America Mission in 1941, the largest independence movement organization of Korean Americans.
I really admire these activities because they worked for Korea's independence despite living far abroad.
It wasn't easy to fight for independence even within Korea, but they did it overseas. I respect their courage.
An Hyun-kyung and Lee Won-sun were two of the many activists abroad who worked for Korea's freedom and independence. They always kept their home country in their hearts and didn't forget where they came from. And it's through their efforts and sacrifices that helped lead to Korea's independence in 1945. 송유진, Arirang News, Cheonan.
Temperatures will take a steep dive tomorrow as a surge of Arctic air mass will settle in overnight. Lows in the capital will plummet significantly to -10 degrees Celsius. Under such extreme cold, there is a risk of frostbite, so make sure to cover up and avoid staying outside for too long. For this holiday, fluctuating weather patterns are expected with frigid temperatures and snowfall. On Sunday, which is a Lunar New Year holiday, the entire nation will see a mix of rain and snowfall. While the capital region will see snow tapering off next week, it will linger in southern parts of the country. Next Tuesday, which is the last day of the Lunar New Year holiday, an extreme cold wave is back in the forecast. Tomorrow, Seoul and Daejeon will be starting off at -10 degrees. Highs will be in the positive range for most regions, creating large temperature gaps. Seoul will get up to 0 degrees, Gwangju 5, Busan will make it to 6 degrees Celsius. Next Tuesday is forecast to be the coldest of the season so far, with lows plunging to -17 degrees. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That's all for this Friday night's newscast. Thank you for staying with us. Have a great long weekend and have a safe and happy holiday.
This week, NAPD will meet with the first ambassador of Slovenia to Korea, Yoon, to hear about Slovenia's charm and the current